Good morning and welcome. We're thrilled to have Dr. Felicity Harley-McGowan with us as an expert in art history. Her specialty has been Christian and medieval art, especially the very earliest of Christian art around the world. Her work centers on the origins and development of Christian iconography with the visual culture of late Roman antiquity, and extends to the survival of the classical tradition from late antiquity through the Italian Renaissance. Before coming to Yale University and to the Yale Divinity School, Dr. Harley-McGowan was the Jerry Higgins Lecturer of Medieval Art History at the University of Melbourne. She was born and raised in Adelaide, Australia, just about an hour by plane south of Melbourne. Please join me as we welcome Dr. Harley-McGowan to be with us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, and do forgive part of the right-hand slide is going to be chopped off during the presentation, so you may have to use your imaginations more than I was counting on. But I did want you to engage your imagination a little this morning because I want to speak specifically about stories, about those stories we know about Christ from the New Testament and the way in which artists began to illustrate those stories across the centuries. And this morning I'm going to speak specifically about the representation of Mary lamenting over the dead body of Christ, because this isn't actually a story that we have recorded in the New Testament. And I thought this morning, as I was sitting in church, some of you may remember the collect. I don't always, I have to confess, remember collects after I've walked out of church. But I wanted to repeat, even though I'm married to a clergyman, I wanted to repeat the first line of this morning's collect, which began, "Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning." What interested me and what I want to speak to this morning is the way in which the scriptures were central to Christianity from the outset. But for artists, or for Christians who began to want to illustrate the content of those scriptures, they didn't always go to the scriptures for the details. And that's where the imagination comes in to play this morning. So I'm going to speak, as I said, specifically about the Lamentation of Christ, which is perhaps an image that you are familiar with more through representations of what we call the Pietà, just the single figure of Mary cradling the body of Christ, which derives from this scene. But Christians in the first few centuries were not particularly interested in stories about death. They were more interested in stories of deliverance from death. Those instances, whether from the Old Testament or from the New, instances where an individual's faith saved them from death or from certain danger. So from the Old Testament, one of the most popular stories was Jonah being disgorged from the whale and being vomited up onto land and then reclining very happily. This was a popular story. From the New Testament, the image that you see here, a representation of the raising of Lazarus. We never see Lazarus. We read about Jesus' own emotion and that of Lazarus' sisters when Lazarus dies. But Christians are not interested in the process of death. They focus on this moment where Lazarus here, Christ's arm is broken off, but he would have been holding what we would call in contemporary language a magician's wand, and he's holding it towards the body of Christ and of Lazarus, and he's drawing Lazarus forth from the grave. Lazarus comes out. He's often shown as he is here with his eyes open, rather like a mummy waddling out of his tomb. So these moments of resurrection, of deliverance from death, are particularly important. And even when we come to the earliest representations of Christ's own death, and this is one of the earliest images that survive, which of course you can't actually see because that's cut off. But on the right-hand side, what we would have seen is a representation of Christ on the cross, but he's not dead. He's alive, just as Lazarus was. His eyes are open, and he's shown as a triumphant, living individual on the cross. So even in these early representations of the Passion cycle itself, the focus is on Christ defeating death, and a focus on images, one of which we see more clearly on the left, the empty tomb. Image of Christ, Christ's resurrection was what early Christian communities were most focused on. And even this is a page from a 6th century manuscript illuminated in Syria. And here we have the crucifixion dominating the top part of the page, and then the bottom scene there, Mary coming to the tomb, but the tomb's all, and she's meeting the angel in the garden. The tomb is empty, and we see Christ walking off to the left, which you can actually see. So we've missed out the section where Christ's body is taken down from the cross. There's a whole component there of the narrative that's missing, and that's what I want to talk to you a little today about. Immediately after Christ's death, that moment is discussed by all 4 of the canonical gospel writers, each of whom connect the episode with the burial of Christ, his entombment. And this connection is an important point, and I want you to remember it, and I'll come back to it later. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the 3 so-called synoptic gospels, have a uniformly clear vision of what we call the deposition, the taking down of Christ's body. And if we take the earliest example, which a part of the text is missing, but you may recall from the Gospel of Mark, Joseph, a rich disciple of Jesus, is alone in asking for Christ's corpse, and he takes responsibility for taking it down from the cross and wrapping it in a shroud. Then Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, watch Jesus being buried. There's no description of or even reference to any lamentation or to their mourning. In the 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, the narrative is elaborated on a little, and Nicodemus is named as being present at the deposition, and the gospel is quite specific about the wrapping of the body, which now includes wrapping with spices. Yet there's still no reference to mourning. The text is very perfunctory, it is vivid, and in offering little by way of explicit detail, it leaves the door open for our imagination as to what happens at this point. And for me, it's interesting to think then, for our imagination, we're very much influenced by images that we're already familiar with. But in the ancient world, when these images had not, or the stories had not been represented, what images were coming to their mind as they imagined what might have taken place? And one particular scene that would have been quite influential, which you can see part of here, there was a very long and strong tradition for the representation of a dead hero being carried by his friends in the ancient world. And I'm showing you just one example from Roman art. The hero Meleager. Some of you may be familiar with your classical history. Meleager, who was very much venerated in Anatolia, which is a mountainous region of Greece, and very famed in Greek literary culture for gathering heroes from all over Greece to hunt a boar that had been terrorizing the region. Meleager kills the boar, and he also killed 2 centaurs who were trying to rape a huntress that he particularly loved. So his heroic deeds were much celebrated. And when he himself was killed, the grief was notoriously extreme. And a classic representation of this grief is what we see here, his dead body, that sense of weight of his body, which is being supported by his friends. And this beautiful figure, I wonder if I can use the mouse to show, at the back here, in a very standard sort of representation, to a very subtle representation, but very moving for the viewer, the covering of the face with a cloth to indicate just how profound the grief and sense of loss is. And this image this kind of the dead hero supported by his friends becomes very influential later. We have an example here, which some of you may be familiar with, a very famous painting by Raphael, where Christ, you could see his body is modelled directly on those ancient earlier types of the dead Meleager. But in early Christianity, there wasn't yet this interest in the dead body in that moment of death. As I said, there was this focus on resurrection. And so the transition from word, the literary description of what happens at Christ's death, and image was not particularly straightforward in early Christianity. Art didn't function merely just to illustrate text or even to provoke emotions of sadness at that period. And the impetus to illustrate the particular moment of the taking down of the body was quite slow in developing. So although the earliest images of Christian art don't emerge until the 3rd century, we don't see any representations of the body being taken down from the cross until the 9th century. So there's quite a long period where what we might consider to be a standard image within Christian culture just does not form part of Christian interest. And so that's what I want to speak a little about this morning, the way in which that image first appears and what happens to it. The earliest surviving depiction of the dead body of Jesus being carried and mourned by his own family and friends is preserved in an illustrated copy of a text of sermons by a 4th century archbishop in Constantinople, a man called Gregory of Nazianzus. So they're 4th century sermons, but in the 9th century there's a lot of interest in them, and we have this beautifully illustrated text of them, although unfortunately it doesn't survive in very good condition, but I'm going to show you a page from the text. This is the page. You can see quite a lot of the paint from the page has flaked off, but enough for us to be able to reconstruct what was depicted here. And you'll notice now there's three registers. I'm going to show you our earlier illuminated page to compare. We have the crucifixion now at the top of the register, and in the second register, which I've highlighted in red, we have on the left Mary has now come to the cross, and 2 figures are beginning to hold the body to prepare to take it down. And on the right of that middle register, a scene of the taking of the body to the tomb, which I'm going to talk about. And then the third register, the resurrection. So in the 6th century, the page I showed you earlier, where we only have the crucifixion and then bang, we go straight to Mary at the tomb and Christ resurrected. Now by the 9th century, people are trying to imagine what happened in that gap, and to begin to fill out the story, as it were. So just to show you a close-up then, the crucifixion, as I said, and then the figures carrying the body of Christ away on the right. And you'll notice Mary, as I said, standing beside the cross. Let's see if we have a detail of her. Now she's begun to take her hands to her face, which seems to us a very restrained gesture of grief. But for the viewers in the 9th century, we know from descriptions of art that survive from this period that this was a hugely emotional gesture and signified to the viewer the intensity of Mary's grief. So she's beginning to show her grief at the cross, and John is standing next to her, and then Christ himself now has one arm that's been taken down from the cross. You might be able to see his left arm has been taken down, but the right arm still remains on the cross. Not much of the paint survives, but you'll notice just underneath his armpit here, where I'm using the cursor, spurts of blood have begun to be shown to indicate that that the body is dead, that it's bleeding, and now he's beginning to be taken down. And that scene that is now appearing for the first time, these 2 figures who are shouldering the weight of the body that's now been wrapped in the grave clothes to take him to the tomb. And this is, of course, Joseph and Nicodemus who take the body. And behind them, you can just make out the outline of this green outcrop of the rocky tomb. And you'll also notice, although we haven't quite got the sense of muscularity and the outline of the form of the body that we had in that classical representation of Meleager, we have got a sense from the artists here, from those two figures leaning over the body, that this is a dead body, that it's heavy, and that they're taking some effort to carry Christ to the tomb. So this is in the 9th century. This is the earliest image that survives of representing the dead body being taken to the tomb. By the 10th century, there'd been a little more experimentation with this story, and we have a development where more of the body is now shown sort of flopping down as it's being taken from the cross. So that sense of weight, of lifelessness, begins to be introduced even when the body is still being taken down from the cross. This, again, surviving from the page of a manuscript, a German manuscript. And now Nicodemus, I hope you can see Nicodemus is actually named. The scribe has illuminated the name of Nicodemus, so we clearly know that he is there. And the garden scene below is also labelled. So we have in Latin hortus here, distinguishing the two stages of the narrative, and Joseph and Nicodemus named as they gently lay now the body directly into a sarcophagus, a coffin-like structure. So in this process, the Gospel of John, with its expanded narrative of this event, becomes popular. And the result, as here, is quite a striking simplicity. The image derives from and is very much dependent still on the type of the crucifixion in terms of how the body is placed on the cross, and the artists begin to wrestle more directly with how do we draw and how do we show a dead body being taken down from the cross? What are the implications on the other individuals who have to bear the weight of the body? How would what would their body language be? How would we show realistically what it's like to struggle with the weight of a dead body? And here again, the deposition and entombment are understood together. They're two sides of the same coin, if you like, in terms of interpreting this story. And both Joseph and Nicodemus taking very primary roles. But soon, other figures begin to populate the scene as artists, alongside preachers and theologians, begin to imagine and explore more directly the reactions of other possible eyewitnesses at the scene. So this is where our imaginations begin to come to play, because the text, as I said at the outset, doesn't give us very much information. So we're beginning to see through other avenues outside of text, people beginning to imagine and enflesh the scene, if you like, both with physical reactions, but also populating the scene with imagined other individuals who are taking part in this historic event. So they begin to focus on what we might call this narrative space. The text, as I said, was very, very simple, very sparse in its information, but there's that little space between what happened at the crucifixion and what happens at the resurrection. And in this case, the space where we see the word hortus, if you like, imagining what happens in between. How did we get the body into the tomb? What other activities were beginning to take place? So the result was that by the end of the 9th century, artists not only began to tackle the subject more regularly, but they begin to do so. There are different experimentations. There's a bit of variety in how the subject is treated. This is one example from Italy, where you see now there's a whole host of other characters that are imagined to be alongside the cross, and also a lot of imagined mechanics of, well, okay, so we imagine the cross would be quite high because the understanding that the figures were erected, the crosses were erected at some height, so the dead bodies of those who were crucified could be seen from a large distance. So if that's the case, then how are we going to get the body down? Well, we have to use a ladder. So different sorts of ideas about the practicalities of dealing with this issue come into play. So here we have one ladder on the right as someone tries to use different kinds of tools to, well, how would we get, if someone's nailed to the cross, how are we going to get the nail out? So we begin to see different tools that are imagined for these practical elements. At the same time as imbuing, this is a nice paradox here, imbuing more daily life practicalities into the image at the same time as including more elements of the divine realm. So we have two angels that are shown very prominently participating in the scene here. In this image now we have not only a ladder, but I love this particular fresco on the right. We now have a little scaffolded platform that's been wheeled in to further sort of complexify this procedure of dealing with the removal of the body. And Mary now also, you might notice here on the left, is taking. So again, we've had that more practical element of machinery coming into the scene, but also now a more intense nod towards what emotions are being felt at the scene. So now Mary, in this very tender gesture, taking the hand of her son and cradling it to her face, and the women behind her, you remember from that 9th century manuscript that Mary held her covered hands veiled to her face in grief, and now the women form like a little chorus behind her, taking their hands to their face in grief. And John also on the left there, resting his head in his hand. So there's more of an injection now of imagined emotion of those onlookers, and a sense of participation more directly in the scene through these assembled characters. So what we're seeing here is a growing interest in the suffering of Christ and of compassionate devotion to his suffering by his family and his friends. And this development is what one scholar has described as one of the greatest revolutions in feeling that Europe has ever witnessed. The deposition becomes a vehicle for contemplating with increasing fervour the pain that Christ endured in the crucifixion. And in this very careful choice of gestures and other visual strategies, the artists invite us, the viewer, to share in that torment and sorrow that's experienced not just by Christ, but now, after his death, experienced by his family. So there are direct appeals to our emotions in order to cultivate more of a direct response from us. But where does this impulse in emotion come from? We've already seen that the New Testament doesn't give us any indication about this dimension of the story. So we need to look at other sources and the way artists might be seen to imagine and visualise those gospel texts, but use other sources to introduce these broader dimensions. So while the Gospels do not describe the deposition in detail, as we've seen, it is clear from literary sources that as early as the 4th century, writers were innovatively expanding the Passion narratives, adding details from the imagination, perhaps from oral traditions that had survived, and focusing attention on the responses of those who witnessed the crucifixion. By the 5th century, there emerges a very specific innovation. So if Christ was crucified, we think around perhaps 36 AD, the 6th century is quite a long time for that to emerge. But by the 5th century, there's this specific innovation of focusing attention on Mary. So it's quite an early emergence of the focus of attention on her, and she's envisaged as lamenting at the cross. Now you can see where this comes from. Mary already mentioned at the cross in the Gospel narrative of John. But by the 5th and 6th centuries, this is taken up more directly, and we have evidence of this specifically from a Syrian liturgy, where her presence is teased out a little more, and the possibilities of what occurs at her presence at the foot of the cross. In this liturgy, she's depicted as crying out against the injustices wrought against her son, and she commands others to weep, in probably a little more of a direct call to participants of the liturgy than we might be necessarily accustomed to today, but a very profound calling for participation of us to experience what she as a mother has experienced. A 6th century hymn from Syria at this same time, entitled Mary at the Cross, written by a hymnographer who was working in Constantinople. A hymn introduces her grief and suffering at the foot of the cross even more explicitly. And this suffering becomes more explicit in other contexts, such as those narrated in a biography of Mary, which is composed in Constantinople in the 7th century. So you can see there's kind of an acceleration of imaginings happening that's manifesting itself in different dimensions liturgically and also in literature. The biography contains an account of the Passion that reflects on her grief and envisions her participation with her son's suffering. And this impetus continues to develop into the 9th and 10th centuries, both in sermons that survive as well as hymns that we all would have sung as part of the liturgy. So we must conclude that the liturgy and preaching are the things that played a pivotal role in the use concurrently of art to provoke lamentation from the viewer, just as those hymns were intended to do. So these early traditions of the life of the Virgin were known and transmitted most prominently by a homilist, a bishop of Nicomedia in the later 9th century. In a particular sermon, he describes Mary at the cross holding and embracing the body and kissing the motionless, wounded limbs, the voiceless mouth and silent lips and the closed eyes. I'm going to show you this particular painting that I think evokes some of that detail most profoundly. Embracing the body now, not just holding the hand, kissing these motionless and wounded limbs and the voiceless mouth and silent lips and closed eyes of Christ. And another text from the later 10th century records that it's actually Mary that lifted Christ down from the cross herself. So here we're at the threshold of the creation of an entirely new scene, an extra episode in the narrative about Christ's death that we don't have from the Gospels. In focusing on the taking down of the body, we've moved into an additional space in the narrative that I commented on was missing before, between the deposition and the entombment. This new pictorial focus on this tender embrace of Mary and Christ is the thing that ultimately creates a new subject, the lamentation. That scene that always involved a group of mourners around the central figures of Christ and his mother. And the impetus is not necessarily illustrating, as I said, narrative, but comes as a response to these other liturgical and literary dimensions that develop in the commemoration of the Passion. One particular illustration or example of the way in which artists are participating in this move to focus on Mary survives from this church in Macedonia. Very beautiful cycle of frescoes that survive in the church that includes this very profound representation of the scene that's missing here, and then now becomes fleshed out, literally here. So this fresco cycle survives from around the 1160s, so in the 12th century, and depicts a little more as, like we had seen with that representation of Meleager, a stronger sense of connection with the fleshly body of that deceased body of Christ. Embracing Christ here, Mary's arm completely surrounding the body, and her other arm cradling around his neck, such that it's not just the hand that she's taking to his cheek in a more delicate fashion that we saw earlier, but now pressing the head of her son next to her. The hand, or one of his hands, is taken now by John, and then at the foot, or at his feet, cradling his feet, we now have Nicodemus and John. I'm going to show you a beautiful detail where we begin to see that sense of the death. Perhaps this is the moment just before his body has completely expired, but the eyes almost rolling back in the sockets, and that profound sense of emotion that's now been able to be captured by the artist in her face. So it's not just a very intimate gesture that is shown and imagined, but also the facial expression now becoming far more profound in conveying to us and perhaps drawing us into this very intimate scene to imagine what the extent of that grief must have been like. We know that this kind of iconography, so this is in Macedonia, and those liturgical developments that I spoke about are in Syria and Constantinople. We know that these developments spread, word of them spreads, as well as images spread to Italy and other countries in the West. Fairly soon after, we have the scene I showed you earlier, one painting by Duccio in Siena in the late 13th century, who's obviously aware of these traditions. But also we have examples from Giotto, who's working in the early 14th century in Padua around the same time. Not just the same compositional format, so the way in which the scene is imagined, but the similar gestures that are used in both images. There's quite a direct relationship, such that we can see the emergence here of a model that artists are familiar with, that they're sharing in order to explore the nature of this scene. In the next century, so this is the early 14th century, in the next century, artists in Italy would continue to explore this particular scene of lamentation, but often returning to those classical heroes that we saw at the outset for more direct inspiration in terms of, again, that carrying the dead weight of the body. But other artists decided, or were moved, perhaps in the case of Botticelli here, who was very much influenced by a preacher in Florence, Savonarola, who was relatively controversial at that time. Botticelli branches out in an even more audacious fashion in some respects, and some people have argued that perhaps he takes it just too far, that the demonstration of grief and of sorrow is taken to almost a hyper-realistic dimension, one step further, that perhaps we can find particularly moving, but perhaps is not quite as poetic or restrained as those earlier images. So I'm going to leave us with this particular image. By the 14th and 15th centuries, then, we have, in a sense, the birth of a new image, one that enfleshes the narrative of Christ's death and resurrection quite profoundly for us, and one which has become used liturgically as well as in private devotional literature and even in private devotional images as a mechanism for an individual Christian to contemplate quite profoundly and intimately what those individual emotions might have been that the mother of Christ or other people assembled at the cross experienced. And giving us this image, Botticelli takes it in one particular direction. Other artists from here will take it in new directions as well, giving us an image that different humans at different periods in our history can imagine in different ways. And one of the important developments too is just that, as I mentioned earlier, the single image of the mother cradling Christ in her lap, which has become one of the most famous images in Western Christian culture, at least, but for which there's no root in the New Testament. It's been given to us by our predecessor Christians who've imagined it for us and asked us to imagine it also. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions if you'd like to.
Yeah, if you went back to the one where you had Giotto and the Macedonian
Yep.
There's a great deal of similarity between the two pictures, the angels and the how would Giotto have known what happened in the chapel in Macedonia? I mean, they had chapters.
No, it's likely that that this had become a known image type, that perhaps we don't have a lot of record of how artists shared ideas. What were the what was the photography or Instagram sharing image source in those days? But one possibility is sketchbooks that may have provided models. Another possibility are portable images. So we know that people are travelling from different parts of the Mediterranean. People are coming from Constantinople into Italy via Venice. And by the 11th and 12th centuries, icons are a particularly popular mode of religious imagery for personal devotion, and we know that they're coming into Venice through trade. So that's one point at which that portable objects are able to transmit types, and that Giotto may have seen the representation on such an image, or artists are talking about that, or sketches being shared. But the point being, I guess, that it isn't an abnormal or a rare thing, but that obviously it's become part of a language that people are sharing, and it's extraordinary to see just how closely that's followed, almost as though it's a text in itself, and that there's a sense that an artist, whether he's in Padua or in Macedonia, adheres to that because that's what's perceived to have happened, and that emotion is something that's documented here, that's real, and therefore we remain true to that by replicating it quite faithfully.
Interesting, you don't think about that much commerce of ideas. Obviously there was.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, that interests me in terms of it's kind of like a it's a visual vernacular that's shared across a very broad geographic region. Good question, thank you. Yeah.
In that regard, when you think then like an image like this, is this reflecting perception or offering a new perception to which people respond?
I think initially it's offering a new perception, and so that's the question. If the triggers for that perception are coming out in a number of different ways liturgically. If people are singing hymns about if it's becoming part of a collective imagining, then the first artistic responses aren't necessarily shocking in so much as they're not differing from what's happening elsewhere, but they are providing a new visual imagining. And then it becomes, accepted as part of a... So yes, in the first instance, new. In the second instance, it's not. I think. I mean, that's my imagining. Yes. Hi.
You showed a picture from a manuscript from early on, and you said it was from Constantinople. How did you come across that? And was it in a monastery, or what happened to it?
Sometimes they're in monasteries and they may be signed by the scribe, or there's enough within. We know that in some cases we can locate the origin of manuscript through the nature of the handwriting, what sort of script is used. So sometimes some manuscripts are known, their history is known because they've stayed in the monastery for a long period of time, and we know the workshops or the monastic settings in which they were produced. It depends from case to case, and sometimes some manuscripts, as I said, they might have a note from the scribe. Like in the case of the first manuscript page I showed you from Syria, the 6th century one, the scribe, whose name is Rabulla, at the end of the manuscript he says, I, Rabulla, completed this manuscript in the year 586. And that's extraordinary. We don't always have that amount of information, but sometimes we do. Or some in the medieval period, some scribes will sign off and say, I, Justinian, finished this manuscript and my arm is really tired, and please forgive me for any errors. So there are a number of ways that we can locate their sort of family tree, if you like, where they've come from. I don't remember the specifics about the Constantinople one, but does that answer?
Yes, it does. I'm sure the monasteries no longer exist. So did they end up in hands? Did they get transported to another country?
All of the above. Sometimes, in the case of the monastery of St. Catherine and Mount Sinai, some of the manuscripts are still there. Other times, in the case in Canterbury, for example, with the dissolution of the monasteries, some manuscripts we can track where they've moved because there will be documentation about to whom they were given or who purchased them, and then they go into a particular collection, so they'll have their movement is tracked quite clearly. In other cases, they just clearly become owned by individuals, and they disappear for several centuries and then they turn up again, which is where things like, if they don't have any inscription that tells us who the scribe was or where they've come from, then we can look at elements like the script at certain periods, obviously what language it's in, but if it's in Latin, for example, a certain script may be used that we know that was fashionable in Constantinople at a particular period, or in Rome in a particular period, and the change isn't as rapid as it becomes, after the 14th and 15th century. So you can locate by the handwriting, the nature of the script, and even pigments that are used. The other important element that we now can use is testing where the vellum. Is it a sheep or is it a goat? Is it a particular breed of sheep? Where were they breeding those sheep? So in one case, a colleague of mine had worked on a manuscript we knew nothing about, but she discovered from scientific testing that it was a particular breed of sheep that was only bred outside a monastery in a particular Italian town, and so she located it through that avenue, and was also then able, from the nature of the vellum, to work out how many animals it took to be killed to create enough pages, and therefore could determine what sort of monastic setting might have produced it, because, i.e., if you needed 80 or 90 surplus sheep to kill just to make your manuscript, then you were a wealthy monastery. So there are all sorts of ways that we can scoop up manuscripts today that have no historical information with them, and we can locate them to a particular time and place.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We appreciate that lecture so very, very much, Felicity. Thank you, thank you, thank you.